in AAAD. She's written 2 books. The most recent, Health Equity in Brazil, examines race and public health policy in that country, and her first book looked at Black feminist movements in Brazil. Claude Clegg is a distinguished professor in the departments of AAAD and history. He's the author of 3 books, the most recent of which, Troubled Ground, examines the impact of a lynching in his hometown of Salisbury, North Carolina in the early 20th century, and raises questions about social memory, identity, and race, especially in the context of violence. Our third panelist, Kenneth Janken, is a historian in the Department of AAAD, who's the author of 3 books, the most recent of which is The Wilmington 10, Violence, Injustice, and Race, and the Rise of Black Politics in the 1970s, which examines the riots following desegregation in Wilmington, North Carolina, and the unjust prosecution of 10 activists, 9 of whom were African American, who were accused of arson relating to those riots. And finally, Ronald Williams is an assistant professor in AAAD. He's a political historian whose research focuses on the influence of African Americans on foreign policy in the post-civil rights era. Just a word about the format. We're gonna begin with 45 minutes of moderated, directed questions by myself to the panel to kind of guide the opening discussion. And at any time, audience members can feel free to post questions using the Q&A feature here on Zoom. And my colleague, Samba Kamara, who's a lecturer here in AAAD, teaching associate professor here in AAAD, he'll be moderating the Q&A. And after 45 minutes, I'm gonna turn the moderation over to him, and he's going to start to engage the panelists with your questions from the audience. So the effort today, or the forum today, we saw it as a sort of effort to pull back the lens on what's happening in contemporary events on police violence and police brutality in the United States, and trying to bring it into focus using historical and social context. Not coincidentally, we're holding this event on Juneteenth, which most of us know is the commemoration of the end of slavery in the United States. But we also know that the end of slavery did not bring equal protection under the law for all American citizens. It did not mark an end to state-sanctioned discrimination or an end to racially motivated violence in the United States. So this is a sort of effort to better understand how we get from then to now. What are the sort of overarching events that shape the contemporary moment? And so with that in mind, I wanted to start with by looking at our own context, the very, very local context of UNC. Many probably followed the recent events. The UNC Board of Trustees overturned a moratorium on renaming campus buildings that had been imposed in 2015, following the years-long successful efforts by student activists to rename Sanders Hall on UNC's campus. It was a building that had been named in honor of a former leader of the KKK in North Carolina. And so that renaming reversal highlights the ways that social changes happen in fits and starts and reversals, and often in response to sustained multi-year, multi-generational efforts for social change. So with that in mind, could the panelists maybe talk about how efforts for racial justice have unfolded on UNC's campus historically, maybe the ways they've engaged or been shaped by national or state-based events, and how that brings us to the present moment. I'll turn that over to any of you that want to jump in.
I'm happy to. I think it's a great question to begin with. I was a student here back in the 1980s, so I have both the view of having been a former student, an undergraduate here, during an earlier time, and now a professor here. I've been here since 2015. And certainly there's some deja vu. Back in the 1980s, there were protests in regard to systemic racism and apartheid in South Africa, and Silent Sam the statue, the Confederate statue on campus. So there's certainly, I'm a historian, so I don't believe that history repeats itself, but certainly sometimes it rhymes. So there's a certain sort of familiarity with the current climate here around memorialization and what gets remembered and how it gets remembered and what history is and who has the rights of definition to what it is. But I do think this is a different moment in a number of ways. I think that the national climate has a lot to do with what happens on the campus. And we don't exist in a vacuum as a campus community, as a city or a town or a state. So I'm not surprised that the recent lifting of the moratorium on renaming of the statues and the various objects of our landscape is happening in this particular moment. If one was being very cynical about it, not that I am, you could say that it's easier to do these sort of symbolic things, such as allow for the renaming of statues and buildings and so forth, as opposed to the heavier lifting of addressing systemic or structural racism around us. Again, that would be a cynical reading. I do think symbolism is important. I think it's important what we call statues and how we name buildings and thoroughfares and what our young people see and have to pass by on the way to class or campus and so forth. But again, I think compared to some of the heavier lifting when it comes to police reform or healthcare access or who gets a mortgage and who doesn't get a mortgage and so forth, a lot of that remains to be done.
Yeah, sure. Ron, would you like to?
Yeah, no, thank you, Professor Clegg and Professor Boyd. I want to follow up with what you said. I think that this is also an opportunity to really praise our students and the efficacy of student protest. I was a student leader in the 1990s, and I think, you know, I got to see and have an appreciation for the demand that students make on the college campuses. I think in many ways students are on the cutting edge of what the issues are, and they're willing to speak out on them in a way that's unique to their role and can engage in the politics of the university space in a way that only students can. I think that I think that we need to also recognize and praise the importance of students as the heartbeat of our university, not just their presence in the classroom, but their presence outside of the classrooms, and that activism is a key part of driving change and driving the university forward. And really at UNC, with what students did, with the activism around the statue, the renaming of Saunders Hall to Carolina Hall, which was a victory. It was not renamed Hurston Hall, but that it was renamed to Saunders Hall was a huge victory. I think those things are incredibly important. Really, they were ahead of the curve here at UNC. So I just wanted to say that and to thank and praise our students and to encourage them to continue to keep doing this work. People may not like the way that they do it. They may not like the demands that they make, but I think we should continue to encourage them to press forward in doing so.
Yes, Kia.
Yes, I agree with Professor Williams, and I just also wanted to add that our department and similar departments and programs wouldn't exist without student activism. So this field has come out of student activism, as we all know, right, in the department, and our students know. And so that has been critical in our country. If we think about SNCC activists and the radical edge that students bring. And, I think student activism is so essential because students are thinking about their future. They're thinking about the next 20 years, whereas some of us have reached that 20+ year point, 30+ year point after college. And I also just wanted to connect the dots. I know we'll talk about police violence soon, but connect the dots as we see protesters doing between police violence and statues coming down around the world, statues that symbolize colonialism and slavery and oppression. And so this is just such a transformative time, I think, and people are making those connections between various manifestations of white supremacy and oppression and racism and racist violence. So symbols do have a real significance in terms of violence. There's a violence that happens on the physical landscape and to people. Even in Fayetteville, in the heart of Fayetteville, I've seen on the news, Fayetteville, North Carolina, there's still this slave market, or having to walk past certain objects. It's very dehumanizing, right? It traumatizes people. And so all of these things are interconnected. And I think in this moment, it's nice to see those things be linked in terms of activism and in terms of the push for social change.
Great. Yeah, I really like that point, linking physical violence to symbolic violence, especially the pertinence of that to UNC's campus because of the sort of the controversy surrounding the Confederate monument on UNC's campus that has been so driven by student activism in the last couple of years, culminating, for those who don't know, in activists pulling down the statue in August of 2018. Does anyone else want to comment on the issues of UNC and student activism before I move on? Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to
Professor.
add. Oh yeah, thank you, Professor Boyd. I
I'm
just
calling
wanted
you
to.
all by your first name. So.
Oh, I know, right? It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. But I think the other part too, and Professor Caldwell, sort of segued into this, that we really have to, within this conversation about police brutality, whether we're having it here or elsewhere, in the country or in the world, really need to take a hard look at the manifestations of global white supremacy, and take a hard look at how it materializes to this day on in our orbit, right, at UNC Chapel Hill. There is a material and psychological legacy of American slavery that affects all of us. It disadvantages those of us, it disadvantages a large portion of us, and it hugely advantages a large portion of us. And it plays out in policing, the origins of the police, and it also plays out in everyday life in ways that we need to take a hard look at to really understand, and work to rectify in real ways that result in tangible improvements in the quality of real people's lives and their ability to be invested in the higher education enterprise in this country.
Thank you. Yeah, with that in mind, thinking about these connections and how in the media, it's often portrayed that police brutality happens in these isolated incidences, right? These rogue actors, right? And it's very difficult when you read these media reports to think about this in a sort of more systemic or historical way, right? So I wanted to sort of turn to the historical lens and think a little bit about how we can think about this in terms of how police violence and police brutality is linked to historical efforts by the state to use violence to recreate systems of inequality and discrimination. And there's a couple of more or less famous instances, probably topmost on people's minds because of the rally tomorrow in Tulsa, is the Tulsa massacre in 1921, where the state sanctioned widespread violence against a Black community that was economically successful and essentially wiped out that community, or wiped out the success and sustainability of that community. And closer to home, a student actually emailed before this forum asking us to speak about the 1898 race riots in Wilmington that changed the makeup of city government by driving African Americans through violence out of the city and changed the demographics of that city for generations to come. So just thinking about instances of brutality and violence not as these singular events, but as ways that the state, the city, or national government have reasserted systems of inequality in our society. If any of you could speak to that.
Let me take my hand at Wilmington, excuse me, a little bit. I think the historical context of 1898 is important to understand, and I'm not sure that that we really capture everything that needs to be captured by talking about state violence against Black Wilmington without talking about what Black Wilmington was up to at the time, and what was occurring in the state of North Carolina and in much of the South at that time. And in 1898, Wilmington was governed by a fusionist government. It was a biracial government. African Americans who were largely associated with the Republican Party at the time, and but also there were black populists, and then there was there were white insurgents, if you will. And their program in Wilmington and the program in the state of North Carolina, this fusionist movement, was democratic. It increased the number of elective offices. It taxed major corporations, the banks and railroads, and it was trying to wrestle power from the economic and political elite. And the attack on in Wilmington, the attack on Wilmington occurred around an election. It was accompanied by a summer of agitation and violence, whereby the leading figures of the state, including was it Josephus Daniels, whose statue was just taken down in Raleigh, drove a wedge between poor blacks and poor whites, and effectively destroyed a government there, and then in the process also expropriated black-owned property, and slaughtered people who went to the polls to try and vote, and exiled a number of people from the state. So I think the context of the riot, the massacre occurring at a time of a sharp political upheaval is important to understand. And in some ways, I would draw a line between what occurred there and what has occurred in the United States in the last month, and the connection I think I am inclined to make is that there is state violence, principally, I guess, police being the first line of that violence, designed to control a population that is unemployed, that is poor, that is and then is as a result resentful and in action against that. But the widespread nature, several people comment on, but it was also intensified by a widespread disease that affected African Americans disproportionately, but also affected what would make the essential workers, I guess, is the word that's being used today, disproportionately, and I think it was also stimulated by the fortunes of a lot of people in the United States not looking so good, and people recognizing that. And so I would just, the connection I think I make there is the widespread the widespread dissatisfaction and unrest.
So what I'm hearing is the violence that you saw in November of 1898 was really connected to a months-long or years-long sort of ferment that was economics as well as racial inequality that gave rise to those riots, that they also were not sort of coming out of nowhere, that there was a larger context here, that a white minority, Wilmington was majority African-American in 1898. Is that correct, Professor Janken? And then the riots changed the demographics of the city?
The riots changed the demographics of the city. I don't recall offhand if it was majority African American at that time or not, but there was, I just don't recall that. It was certainly a city of, a prosperous city, and African Americans were scattered throughout the economy, real estate. There was a daily newspaper, there was banks, there was other ownership, cotton compresses and things like that, where longshoremen.
I believe at that time, Wilmington had a Black mayor, and there were, I know you said scattered, Kenneth, but a number of Black-owned businesses and prominent African Americans, and Wilmington was the most prosperous city in North Carolina at the time. When I think about the Wilmington Massacre, I also think about the fact that it was the first of this series of massacres that we see. It's talking about Tulsa now, but Wilmington happened, 23 years before Tulsa. It happened before the Rosewood Massacre in Florida. And to me, something that's striking also is that even at the National African American History and Culture Museum in DC, the Smithsonian Museum, they have a display about these massacres, and Wilmington is not part of that. So I feel that we should all write into the museum, but when we think about how these things are remembered or whether they're remembered, those of us who've taught students from Wilmington, I know certainly the students that I've taught about the massacre never learned about it in their schools. The same has been true of Tulsa, right? So these really profound moments of racist violence and racial terror have also been erased from the curriculum and erased from historical memory. Josephus Daniels, our student store, UNC student store, is named after him, and he fomented much of the propaganda for the Wilmington Massacre as the publisher of the News and Observer, and then people like Charles Aycock were involved, William Keenan Sr., and so even the symbolism and the naming on our campus is tied to this really pivotal incident for the Black community and for the state.
One of the big questions in regard to Wilmington and the period that we're talking about now, the biggest question perhaps is who's the human being and what sorts of rights are due that individual. It was not a settled question in much of the 19th century who a human being or what a human being was, particularly up through slavery and even after the end of slavery in this country, the formal end of in 1865. It was an unsettled question about who was human and what sort of rights was due to a human being. The other question that's related to that is who's a citizen and what sort of rights are due a citizen. And Wilmington is against the backdrop of both of those questions. That is, are Black people, one, human? Are they as human as white people? Are they citizens? Do they have a right to the public square? Do they have a right to hold jobs in the professions? Do they have a right to show up at the ballot box? Wilmington has taken place in a larger context in which Blacks en masse are being disfranchised with literacy tests and poll taxes and KKK violence and so forth. Jim Crow, or our system of segregation in this country, is being codified, is being legislated into existence by various states, including this one, North Carolina. So Wilmington is sort of a culmination of these things, as my colleagues just mentioned. This question of, and it's not a mistake or it's not a coincidence that Wilmington takes place in an election year, 1898, and close to the election itself in November. That's not a coincidence. So the motivating question or motivating questions were who's a citizen going into the 20th century? That was not a settled question in this country, and you could argue it still is not completely a settled question in regard to the rights of citizenship. But also more fundamental than that, what is a human being? And this is also during the era of lynching. The 1890s is the high crest of lynching in this country, in which mobs would inflict themselves on individuals, usually African Americans, almost always African Americans, for some perceived slight against communal norms, or sometimes, or mostly really, to draw very clearly lines of racial privilege and racial subjugation between Blacks and whites. So Wilmington is a flashpoint, but it's also part of this longer genealogy of those questions. What is a citizen and what is a human being? And how do these newly enfranchised or newly emancipated people who had only been by that time emancipated by about 30 years or so. So slavery was still very much a living memory in Wilmington in 1898. What is due to those folks?
Great points, Professor Clegg. And I think this leads to another question I had, which is thinking about, again, how the connections between the ways that racism functions in our society, from these sort of extreme acts of violence to the more invisible ways, visible, invisible, or less obvious ways that racism functions. We've mentioned so far redlining, voting rights, of course, the Jim Crow era. These were more institutionalized forms of racism that were driven by these questions of what rights are due people, and how should the state treat people? Should they treat all people equally, as you rightly point out? There's been in the news recently, a college student had requested that Merriam-Webster revise its definition of racism. Up until her request, racism, their definition had really focused on individual prejudice as the definition of racism, and it ignored any acknowledgement of systemic racism. And she had argued that racism functions more as just personal prejudice, but is shaped by forms of institutional power and inequality. And they, in fact, have acquiesced to her request and are revising their definition. So maybe some of the panelists could sort of explain what systemic racism is and why it's important to think about racism as functioning as more than just an individual prejudice or individually held bias against certain groups of people in the United States. Does anyone want to jump in with that one?
Happy to.
And I'll follow.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I always assume in my own personal definition of racism that we were talking about systems and structures and so forth. I never assumed that it was a singular thing. It operates in interpersonal relations between people. It can be internalized. It can be digested by an individual and operated in psychologically damaging ways within an individual. And then it can operate and does operate in these grander ways, whether it's, we call it structural racism or systemic racism or institutional racism and so forth. Systemic racism, it typically operates in the grander ways in which people, forces have either purposefully, inadvertently sometimes, very consciously and other times, erected structures, organizations, laws, and so forth in a way intended, or at least that function in a racially discriminatory way based on certain racial assumptions and interests. So, for example, and they're all around us, the way in which systemic racism operates. When a bank decides it's not going to give loans to people who live in a certain zip code, knowing full well that perhaps there's a large African-American population in that zip code, that's, you know, on the face of it, people can just say, well, the bank is making a decision about who is going to give loans to based on property values or so forth. But that's a very, you know, it's not even a clever expression of systemic racism, but that's a system that's operating to produce certain outcomes in regard to who gets mortgages and who doesn't. In regard to employment, there have been many studies that have shown that based on names on CVs, a person may not get an interview. That is, a name that sounds sort of race neutral or Europeanized name, such as a James or a Susan may get that call back. Jamal or Shamika may not, because it sounds ethnic. It sounds like an African American name. So those are systems. That's not just the sort of interpersonal, street level racism, but those are ways in which systems operate. Voting. The state of Florida got rid of early voting on certain days, knowing full well, those legislatures, if they did any homework, that early voting is very popular with African American voters. And in many instances, they would get rid of voting on the Sunday before the election, knowing, I think, full well that many African American churches have their souls to the polls trips to the voting place to vote. They disproportionately show up early, and on that particular day, the Sunday before they vote, African Americans in disproportionately high numbers show up. And there have been several states that have not only reduced early voting, but made sure that people were not voting on that Sunday. Again, that's a system, that's a structural impediment to racial equality, a legal impediment that is written into law. So I always assumed that racism was always a multi-layered thing. I welcome the new definition in the dictionary, but I always assumed it wasn't just this sort of interpersonal, you don't like someone's skin color thing, but it operated on various levels, whether it's this sort of internalized messaging that a person gets from the system in regard to their supposed inferiority or superiority, or the sort of grander things that affect whole communities, such as who gets that mortgage and who doesn't, based on the zip code.
Right. Yeah, Professor Williams.
And I just wanted to follow up, and I think that everything that Professor Clegg is saying is that racism is as American as apple pie. It is a core American value. It's central to every aspect of life in this country. And when in my classes, we talk about racism, as we all do in our classes here. And I go to the definition posited by the late psychiatrist Frances Cress Welsing. And her theory is that racism, this is quote, racism or white supremacy is the global and local power system and dynamic structured and maintained by persons who classify themselves as white, whether consciously or subconsciously determined, which consists of patterns of perception, logic, symbol formation, thought, speech, action, and emotional response as conducted simultaneously in all areas of people activity: economics, education, entertainment, law, labor, politics, religion, sex, and war, for the ultimate purpose of white genetic survival and to prevent the white genetic annihilation on the planet Earth, a planet upon which the vast and overwhelming majority of people are classified as non-white by white-skinned people, and of all the non-white people are genetically dominant compared to the genetic recessive white-skinned people. That's the part of her definition that I use in my teaching.
Great. So obviously emphasizing the systemic nature of racism, I think, is coming through in that definition. And I think this discussion of definitions also highlights for us the ways that definitions themselves are not neutral, right? They are socially produced and they are debatable, right? We've moved on from feeling like the Merriam-Webster dictionary is infallible, like we can't debate it. And we obviously do. And I'm very happy that a college student decided that she would take up the dictionary company itself and challenge them on how they had decided to represent what racism was. Are there any last comments? Yeah, Kia?
Yeah, if I could just also add, one of the things I think that's helpful in thinking about structural, institutional, or systemic racism is that those definitions or conceptualizations emphasize that even in the absence of intentional discrimination, racism is built into the system. So it doesn't necessarily rely on so much on the individual action or even individuals realizing what they're doing sometimes. People can participate and perpetuate systemic racism and be well-meaning, that's where we also have to get to, am I a racist? Or I didn't think I was a racist. But when it is baked into the system and into the DNA of institutions, then I think unless we're self-consciously working to counteract it or to be anti-racist, as even people like Ibram Kendi might say, we are perpetuating that system through our actions. And so I think that's also what's really helpful, that it's bigger than just one individual or two individuals. So you might have one or two nice loan officers who are going to give, the mortgages to the Black people. But what happened during the whole, what happened in 2008, 2009, and how were African Americans disproportionately affected by that mortgage crisis and the types of loans that were offered and defaulting and foreclosures, and why now is African American home ownership that rate lower than it was during Jim Crow, right? I also just wanted to add that as someone who does research in Latin America, thinking about institutional racism has been important in Brazil because they did not have legalized racial discrimination. However, racial discrimination did exist and it was institutionalized. It just was never legalized by a Supreme Court decision like Plessy v. Ferguson. And it continues to operate in institutional ways that disenfranchise Afro-Brazilians in certain kinds of ways, marginalize them, and that perpetuate inequalities in ways that people might not recognize as being racism.
Thank you for that. I think maybe I'll ask one more question and then we can shift to the audience questions. So if people out there have questions that they want to ask, they can feel free to start writing them up into the Q&A area. So we have them ready and we'll have enough time to get to them. I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about the activist movement that's currently underway and the ways that we think about who's involved and who's organizing this movement against police brutality. A lot of the highest profile cases of police brutality have obviously been brutality and acts of violence against African-American men and boys. But African-American women have also been subject to and targeted for police brutality and bear the burden of systemic violence. Breonna Taylor's death has, recently, alongside George Floyd's, gotten a lot of attention in the last few weeks. So I was wondering if panelists could speak to the gendered nature of police brutality, the gendered nature of activism, the role of African-American women in organizing, the response to police violence, and the activist movement against police violence.
I can definitely speak to some of those issues. I'm glad that we're talking about this because Black women often become invisible in discussions of police violence, and we see that repeatedly in the media. So Breonna did not come to light for several months, similar to Ahmaud Arbery, but from what I understand, her sister kept pushing to get some recognition that this had happened. And as terrible as the police murders of Black men are, we can't forget it's also happening to Black women, it's happening to Black trans women, it's happening to Black trans men. So it's gender and sexuality and sexual orientation and gender identification need to be part of the conversation as well. Even lynchings happen to Black women and to Black children. Look at Emmett Till, right? The Say Her Name movement has definitely been at the forefront of calling attention to literally saying the names of Black women who have been killed by the police and by state-sanctioned violence. And I know that, for instance, my colleague Kristen Smith at UT Austin has done work on what she calls sequelae and the compounded effects on families, especially Black women, when one of their loved ones has been killed by the police. So there are these lingering traumas that people experience and that also communities experience. There's research that has shown that women during pregnancy, if there has been sort of violent crime in their neighborhoods or perhaps a police incidences of police violence, that this affects their pregnancies and their children in the womb. So we definitely need to be thinking about gender and highlighting and bringing sort of more visibility to these issues for Black women. And also, if we think about the Black Lives Matter movement, it was founded by 3 Black queer women, Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometi, and Alicia Garza. But oftentimes the face of the movement becomes a Black man, which speaks to larger issues of sexism also in the Black community and the hierarchy even within the Black community of valuing certain voices more or even in some ways certain lives more. So we really have to tackle these issues of gender, I think, in terms of how we think about police violence.
Thank you. Are there any other comments before we shift gears? Okay, I think I can come back with more questions if there aren't questions from the audience, but why don't we give, I'll turn this over to Professor Kamara, who can maybe read some of the questions from the audience members. Your mic is turned off. Oh, there we go.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I must give the props to our panelists, Professor Clegg, Caldwell, and Williams. This is wonderful and very rich in terms of providing a historical context to these recent events. And I think there's one note that I wanted to make about race, because it's something that's been fascinating. We are all fascinated about it. And I wanted to point that it's not just skin color. Race is any variable that can be used to create hierarchies among human societies. And that variable can be a physical feature of any kind. Also, it is a phenomenon that historically has occurred in a way that, you know, people do racist actions inadvertently. And I'm glad that Kia pointed that. And I think in that regard, a question that I had personally towards the panel, and then I'll get to the other questions, was if we consider the reality that white Americans have a role to play, right, in this historical crisis, knowing that if you look at the American voting age population, for example, whites represent at least 70% of that American voting age population compared to the other minorities. So what do you think is the role of white Americans? Again, because I do not see racism in the US as a problem of Black people or as a problem of just white people. This thing has come into being because there has been a historical interaction between whites and Blacks. And we know also that Africans didn't choose to make their history or to make themselves a part of white history. We know that it is historically a European, investigation sort of that created this phenomenon of racism. So what do you think then within this modern American context, what do you think is the role of the white American if they were to take the responsibility that is due to them in resolving this historical crisis? Thank you. And then I think you should, I'll let you say a few words about my question, and then I'll move to the next question from the audience.
It's a great question, Professor. And probably too big for us to give it justice in this particular forum. But just a few comments. Yeah, I think that you're exactly right. This is the problem of race in this country is certainly not just something that African Americans or Native Americans or Latinos or others who have been racialized by this country should be charged with dealing with. If that were the case, if it was something that Black people could just fix, I think it would have been fixed long ago. So I do think that you're exactly right. This is something that's going to take some heavy lifting, that's going to take a nationwide sustained effort. I think that, and you can see how the current administration has really played this. I think one of the things, I know one of the things that is an obstacle to much in the way of sort of the interracial, not only reconciliation, but work that needs to be done in regard to racial equality, in regard to police violence and so forth, is that it's been painted as a zero-sum game. That is, if they win, we lose. And again, if you really want to see how powerful appeal that is, just look at the current administration and how it got there and how it still has a sizable chunk of the American people supporting it, despite all we've seen and what we know about this particular administration. But if you position the problem as one that if this group, however aggrieved they may be, however deserving they are for justice and equality and opportunity and so forth, if they get that, then we lose something. We lose privilege, we lose jobs, we lose positions in office. I think that sort of positioning of the problem, one, is the wrong one, but I think it has historically been a very powerful one in this country. From the very beginning and through Reconstruction and the talk during that time of Negro domination, although most of the offices during Reconstruction, this period after the Civil War, was still in white hands, it was very easy to sort of amp up white resistance to Reconstruction based on this notion, if there are Blacks holding office, then that means they're dominating us, although the numbers did not say that. And again, it's a powerful appeal here in the 21st century. That is, if these folks are crossing the border, or these folks are allowed to vote or even mail in their ballots, if these folks have access to health care, then we, the larger white group, loses. Again, a very, very, very powerful, very toxic, but very powerful appeal. So we have to get beyond that. I don't know how that happens. I think that if I read your comments correctly, that is, there's some mechanisms within a democracy that might allow that to happen. And while you're mindful of the fact that there's a white majority in this particular democracy, if a democracy operates as it's supposed to be, a good number of that white majority has to be on board with any systemic changes that take place, especially at the ballot box. I do think the history is what it is, and those appeals to race, and again, the zero-sum game of race. If our group gives an inch and that group benefits, we are losing and they are winning. And again, it's a very powerful appeal, as I think we can see very well in our political climate coming from the very top.
You know, I think it is a powerful appeal, and certainly historically it has been. But I think it's also, and I don't know how things will go from here. You know, I can't project what it will have, what things will look like in a year from now or 6 months from now. But the things I've seen over the last month is that the types of explanations that Professor Clegg just outlined seem to be holding increasingly less appeal. You know, public opinions, you know, so public opinions say on police violence. There are, you know, a greater percentage of the population, including a greater percentage of the white population, now says that police are more likely to use more force and more deadly force, or use deadly force more often against African Americans than against whites. You know, there's that. The fact that there, you know, the participation of larger numbers of whites, including young whites, in these demonstrations seemed to me, what I took away from some of this was that the power of that explanation, that zero-sum game, blaming others, blaming, you know, blaming people of other groups and designating them for disparate treatment seems to be, seems to be losing, seems to be shaking. Whether that will continue or not, I don't know. But you know, the immiseration of large numbers of people in the United States, people losing their houses, people losing health care, people losing all sorts of job security, the the growth of the gig economy, would seem to me that that's making people, I think, rethink some of the ways, that the ways that they used to make sense of the world before. I wonder if it's not beginning to change some. So that would
if
require,
I can just,
in my mind, as a political matter, that would require more work along those lines. So,
if I can just chime in also, I do think that capitalism is the elephant in the room, and neoliberal capitalism, in this moment. But, if we think about race, it's been used, and I think this dovetails with what Professor Clegg was saying. Race has been used to divide the working class historically in this country, to divide Black and white folks who could ally. And we are seeing perhaps some new alliances now and coalitions forming and all that kind of thing. And that takes us back to diffusion politics, and the overthrow of the Fusion Party here in North Carolina with the Wilmington massacre, because that was dangerous, having Black folks and white folks, work together and be involved in the same political party. But I also, as we think about the changing demographics of this country and the fact that by 2045, it will be a majority people of color nation, that's 25 years. I mean, things are changing very quickly. The South, Georgia, you look at Stacey Abrams, Georgia is becoming a majority people of color state. And so it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out, as Professor Janken was saying, but there is a fear of those demographics and what those demographics will mean for this zero-sum game logic. And so we do have to shift the logic. And I think this is where someone like Reverend Barber comes in, the Poor People's Campaign, linking multiple struggles. It's not just about race, it's about poverty, it's about ecological devastation. We have to, again, connect those dots because, the other thing I wanted to say, and I know we haven't really talked about police violence, but it's that, if Black people can be killed the way we're being killed, anyone can be killed. And so it's good to see that white folks are getting more concerned about this, because it won't just stop at Black people. It's also affecting Indigenous people. We know about detention camps and so forth at the border, southern border for, immigrants coming from Latin America. And so these issues of state-sanctioned violence and repression affect us all. We saw a 75-year-old white man, I guess in Albany, New York, be knocked down by the cops, right? So this is pretty critical, I think, for everyone in this country to pay attention to.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these comments. Let me now move on. I must acknowledge that we've received a lot of questions, and we'll just have to, so if I'm not able to get to your question, please, dear audience members, understand that it's a matter of timing. So, and then I'll go with the first question that I've received here. This person says, can you speak to the limitations of the 13th Amendment and how that has led to the historical criminalization of Black life? Again, you can, let me.
Yes. I'm happy to weigh
live here. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm happy to weigh in as a historian. I'm not a legal historian, but I do know something about the period and certainly about the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment gets ratified and added to the Constitution as part of the Reconstruction Amendments to the Constitution in the wake of Confederate defeat in the Civil War. And it was to abolish slavery, or to finish what the Emancipation Proclamation sort of started during the war, and to abolish it once and for all. It does have exceptions in it. One, the big one, it has to do with it allowing individuals who've been committed or been convicted of crimes and so forth be compelled to work as they have lost their liberty. There's a whole sort of sorry history in this country in regard to how that particular clause of the 13th Amendment has been abused in terms of chain gangs, in terms of the convict lease system, in terms of a whole range of sort of mechanisms designed, if not to reinvent slavery, then certainly give us something of the same sort of texture, at least in certain quarters of the society, and not just in prisons. Again, a whole system that comes into play after slavery, some would say it was sort of a reinvention of slavery alongside the sharecropping tenancy system, is a convict lease system in which a person can go down to the prison, pay a person's bail, and then more or less lease a prisoner to work on the railroad and so forth. And that was compelled labor. And that was totally legal. And that also included what happened in prison camps. People sentenced to hard labor and benefiting the state with that hard labor. So the 13th Amendment and its genealogy is very problematic in regard to African Americans in particular, since they were often the ones who were disproportionately imprisoned, even coming out of the Civil War, and subject to policing for things such as vagrancy or more or less being out in public while not working. You could be locked up. That was a crime in the 19th century. And African Americans were disproportionately rounded up for those reasons. Anything that could tag you as a criminal, anything that could tag you as out of place, anything that could get you roped into the criminal justice system, you could find yourself in a situation which the 13th Amendment did not apply to you anymore. That is, you could lose your citizenship and lose whatever constitutional protections you might otherwise thought you had. And there's a large, of course, conversation about the criminal justice system and how it has been used to de-citizenize, if you will, people, especially African Americans. But the 13th Amendment, again, has, I think, rightly a very positive history of ending slavery, but it also has this sort of darker side in these clauses, this particular clause in particular, that allowed slavery to reinvent itself or to have an afterlife after the institution was supposedly abolished by the 13th Amendment itself in 1865.
I would just add to that, or maybe depart from one of the points that you made, Professor Clegg, was that the 13th, that the issue of forced labor after the passage of the 13th Amendment was designed to keep African American laborers keep them in place and keep that labor force readily exploitable. And I agree with you that it is rightfully, that it rightfully has a positive, that it has a positive impact. And the first I had heard of from the question was from what was the film 13, the documentary about the 13th Amendment, and I thought that it was I thought that part of it's a metaphor, but I thought it was ahistorical, and so I would just leave it at that.
Awesome. So Professor Janken, pardon my earlier omission. I am a very visual person. I didn't see your live here, and I think I skipped your name. So thank you for your insights as well. Let's move to another question. This person says, as of fall 2017, UNC had a 7.8% enrollment rate for Black students, while just over 22% of residents in North Carolina are Black. Do you think UNC needs to make an effort so that the UNC enrollment rate reflects state demographics?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. As a state institution in which statutorily, that is, we're required by law to admit, I think the percentage is 83% of our undergraduates have to be from North Carolina. So we're even more of a state institution than your average public university around this country. in which we draw such a high proportion of our undergraduates from the state itself, which I think makes it even more imperative that that large number of North Carolinians coming into the institution reflect the state of North Carolina more so than it does at the present time. I think it's when you have a university that has purposefully positioned itself as such a state institution that it draws the lion's share of its students, according to law, I think about 83% from the state itself. I think it's harder to make the excuse that, well, our student body comes from all over the world, or this is a national institution, and it should perhaps look more like the national demographics, in which you have African Americans about 13% of the national population. So I think the state, I applaud the state for being the kind of state institution in which it has foregrounded the need to educate people in the state in a large proportion, again, about 80+%. But that raises the bar. That is, if you have a Black population that's almost a quarter, and you're less than 10%, and you have purposely made yourself out to be this very North Carolina, Carolina blue sky institution, I think that you have to be even more conscious of the disconnect between the numbers, percentages that are here, and the percentage of people who are in the state who identify as African American.
If I could just also add, I think similarly, our faculty and administration should reflect the demographics of our state. I like to just say this is not Iowa, right? So we should have more Black faculty. This is an area that's attractive to many African Americans, and making that commitment as well in terms of faculty diversity, particularly if we start to increase our numbers of African American students. And this will happen, hopefully, as the demographics of the state continue to change and the country continue to change. But it also cannot, it's possible for it not to happen because of the K through 12 system, and if the institution is not aggressive about bringing a diversified student body to the campus.
Awesome. Any more comments on this? I will move to, let's see, what are we doing on time, Lydia? Do you have an idea about timing? Are we good? We go for a couple of more questions?
Yeah, it ends at 4:30.
Okay, good. So we have another question here from this audience member who is asking as follows: could you discuss prison industrial complex abolition, in particular by advocating for killer cops to be convicted? We justify the need for the prison systems to abolish. So I am wondering how to get justice for victims of police brutality while still striving for the goal of abolishing the police. So this is another question for all of you. So.
Well, to connect what was said earlier by Professor Clegg and Professor Janken about the 13th Amendment, the prison industrial complex is seen by many activists as a continuation of enslavement in a new form, or, Michelle Alexander has referred to it as the new Jim Crow. And Angela Davis coined the term the prison industrial complex. And I think this, thinking about imprisonment and policing, we need to put all of these things in conversation with each other, because activists certainly have. And I know that organizations like Critical Resistance, that was formed 20 years ago by people like Angela Davis and Julia Opara, scholar activists. And if we think about Angela Davis again, she was a political prisoner, right? So if we fast forward from 1865 to 1965 and then the 1970s, and think about policing, a lot of surveillance started to happen in Black communities in the 60s and 70s. And there was an upsurge in criminalization of African Americans I know, thinking about statues also, Frank Rizzo, who was the police chief in Philadelphia, where I'm from, and he then became mayor, his statue was recently removed from Philadelphia because he was a major fomenter of police brutality in the city, right? And so imprisonment, if we think about mass incarceration, there are currently over 2 million Americans imprisoned in this country, and several million under some form of supervision. So 6.5 million people are under some form of supervision, including parole. There are increasing imprisonment rates amongst women of color, African American and Latina women, and also girls of color, to bring gender into that discussion again. And so when we think about the prison industrial complex, it also is linking capitalism and the fact that we have private prisons that people can invest in, and that prisoners often are making goods similar to the convict leasing kind of situation, but they're often making goods and commodities that are sold. An example I often give to students is that when I taught in California, we were talking about the prison industrial complex in class, and then I looked under a desk and there was a sticker that said the desk had been made by prison industries. And I thought, this is what we're talking about. Prisoners making desks for university classrooms, and they would never be able to go to those universities because of the school to prison pipeline, right? So if you look at California, more money was being invested at one point in prisons than in schools. And I think that also links with the defund the police push, which is, activists and communities saying, we don't want millions to be poured into the police. We want them to go into our schools, healthcare, and things that help the community, not policing that is killing people, right? So we have policing on one hand, but then we also have the prison industrial complex. And practices like stop and frisk in New York, those would lead to higher arrest rates, which then meant that people were, potentially going to prisons, right? So policing and imprisonment are definitely interconnected.
Very good. Okay, so if there's no more comments on that question, I'll move to the next question. And that's the following, where the person asks to all the panelists, can you speak on the intersectionality of the queer community and the Black community and how they are not separable?
Okay, shall I? I think that they are not separable. If you see the with the Black Lives Matter banners being painted in the streets, starting with Washington D.C., there was one that was added that said all Black Lives Matter. And I think that is one of the areas that Black Americans in general must take up. That the sort of Blackness and Black lives and the value of them cannot be gendered. Along class position, gender, or sexual orientation or identity, and that's pretty much it as far as I see it, right? That we have to address homophobia and anti-queer sentiments in the Black community in general. And the origins of that date to notions of respectability politics in the early 20th century, and what is normal and what is socially acceptable. But there have always been queer Black people, and we need to acknowledge and celebrate and protect and advocate for their lives and well-beings as well.
Wonderful, Ron. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to look into the long list of questions here. Just bear with me. Right. So also I was thinking, as I go through this list of questions about the responsibilities also of, or rather the duties of because I think education is one of the spaces, right? You have the streets, you have the, we have the streets, we have the classroom as the learning spaces, where we get shaped as human beings. So what do you think is the duties and the responsibilities of school teachers, but also of parents when it comes to early race education in particular? And that's just a personal question that I want to put there before we move on.
Can I tackle part of it?
Yes, please.
And so, Professor Kamara, I think that's an excellent question. And I think we need to look at race education, not just early, but race education as a whole. And certainly it starts at the beginning of schooling, but it continues all the way through university. And how much of it's required, and the fact that students, around the country can finish their entire education and take no class or read no book dealing with race. It is still possible in 2020, and there's so much scholarship out there. And I think we need to require it. There is a, recently as yesterday, the California State Assembly passed a bill that requires ethnic studies, one ethnic studies course that every student must take before completing the bachelor's degree at any one of the 23 California State University campuses. And so it takes bold, sweeping action like that at the university level, but also at the K-12 level to help, young people walk into the world with at least some basic understanding of the world in which we live and exist. And so I think it must, even if it doesn't start, it should start again at the beginning of schooling, because people become racialized and socialized around race very early on, even as babies. But it should certainly be unacceptable for them to graduate from university without taking classes in racial and ethnic studies. And, I think that's something that we must address here at UNC Chapel Hill. I remember at one point, our former chancellor, Carol Folt, in one of her public statements said that how much she supported the department and her belief that every student at the university should take a class in the Department of African American and Diaspora Studies, and how transformative it would be for our course offerings, but also for students in general to be required to take a class in AAAD. It would certainly help them to understand, in this moment, why it's not all lives matter, but why it is in fact Black Lives Matter.
I agree that, may I make a comment? I agree that the curriculum is really a place where as we know, a lot of work needs to be done, because we teach students who come into our courses not knowing much about Africa or African Americans, right? And it can't start when you're 17 or 18 in an optional course that you might stumble upon, it has to happen at the K through 12 level. Texas also has passed something recently about African American history in terms of their curriculum. And I work with teachers on some of these issues. So, I think we do have to be hands-on, those of us who do this work. But of course, parents also play a critical role. And I think right now, the national conversation around race is also highlighting this, that white parents need to be talking to their kids about race and racism, and so do parents who are Black and Latinx and Asian American and Native American, that we all need to be having these conversations at home, and so many more of us are at home now. And I have found that as a parent, I've consistently and always had to supplement my children's education. They have not learned what I feel they need to learn in school, and I've brought it up to their school administrators, who may be watching, probably not. But it's a constant battle. And we also have to keep in mind that the United Daughters of the Confederacy have been behind what's in our textbooks. They have commissioned people to write the textbooks, right? And so all of this, again, is very much interconnected. If our kids are learning like one paragraph on slavery, that's been very much intentional in so many cases. But also, just to get back to the parental role, research has shown that colorblindness doesn't work when we're raising our kids. We can't raise them to be colorblind. We need to raise them to be color conscious. And if that colorblindness is more harmful to African American children than having real conversations about race and racism. So it has to be multifaceted.
Wonderful, excellent. And with that, I move to the next question from the audience. In the opinion of the panelists, which anti-racist legislative government measures at any level, excuse me, are most realistically going to be enacted in the near future? And what will be the implications and possible success level of enacting these measures?
I think that there may be, and I'm tentative in this, but I think that the conversation about policing and in particular how police forces are used and their resources are used is getting a serious look, whether it's people calling for the abolition of police departments or whether it's defunding police departments and so forth. Firstly, looking at what they call upon police to do, whether it's makes any sense to call upon police to deal with problems of homelessness or problems in regard to mental health or drug addiction and so forth, or whether that money is best shifted away from police forces that are really not trained to deal with the whole range of things that they're called upon to deal with, to mental health, to social services of various sorts, and so forth. So I do think that that's a serious conversation that's long overdue and that's being had. I don't know what it's going to look like. I imagine it's going to be an unevenness in regard to its application, this question of whether police forces will be funded or defunded or resources shifted away. But my sense is that at least in some locales, you're going to see serious conversations about what police are called upon to do and how public resources are deployed to carry out those functions. There will be resistance, I think. I just read today that the mayor of Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser, just asked for a 3.3% increase in the police budget. At the same time, as she's in Black Lives Matters marches. And, not to say that, at least in her mind, you can't square the two things, but I don't think it's a slam dunk that we're gonna have a lot of resources steered away from police forces into social services, into healthcare and so forth. But I do think the pressure is there, which is good, from activists and folks who care about these matters. And if that pressure continues at some very high rates, sustainable rates, I do think there you'll have a situation in which some serious consideration will be given to how police resources are used.
Very good. And talking about pressure, Professor Clegg, I was also wondering how local authorities are going to deal with pressure coming from police officers themselves, because this morning I was reading news in Atlanta that there are 2 zones where police didn't show up. Police officers didn't show up in response to, how the officer who killed Rayshard Brooks, is sort of being criminalized. So I wonder how local authorities are going to deal with that pressure from police, because we still need police. We want them to show up.
That's not unusual. I can remember cases in which, very similar cases in which some unarmed Black person was killed, and then there's the outcry, and then perhaps some offending officer or suspected offending officer is arrested, and then policing sort of stops, sort of a protest by some on the police force that if you go after one of our own, I suppose that might be the thinking, we'll show you how much you really do need police. And we're not going to arrest people, we're not going to patrol anymore. So this is a variation of a fairly old story in which there are, one of it says, it says something about the sort of nature of, in some police culture, the we versus them, the philosophy that motivates much of it. That is, even if you go after the most rotten of us, those who captured on video abusing and killing stuff, that's too far, you know, and we will respond to that, you know, or our police union will respond to that and so forth. That's a cultural thing that's very much ingrained. That is a sort of warrior cop, the we versus them. That is, any sort of effort to rein in police is an assault on the police, an assault on the idea of policing. I'm not sure how Atlanta is going to deal with that. The mayor there has been quick to fire offending police, although that's a reactive stance. That's not a proactive, preventive stance. It's a reactive stance, but she has been quick to call for the firing of police. I think it's unsustainable for police simply not to police anymore. And if it becomes a sort of epidemic of police not policing, I think we're well on the road for the need to a reorganization of policing nationally, if that's the case in which people just stop policing. But I did note what you just said in Atlanta, but this is a sort of an old story in which you see police pull back, I think, to make a statement about anyone who would dare criticize them, even the worst among them.
Wonderful. Excellent. So we have, we still have time for one more question at least, I think. And this goes, can you address, well, this still pertains to education, which is central, as you know, in this conversation. Can you address textbook production? Who writes them? Well, pardon the word that's being used here. I wouldn't use this, but anyway, I had a world history text published in 2017, which explained that the sugar industry in the Caribbean was so labor intensive that the producers, quote unquote, had to routinely return to Africa for more slaves. Had to, so I think the question is here about the expression, I mean, the verb here, had to. What does this insidious and sometimes blatant racism does to assigned text when integrated into the authority of a classroom? So this is a question that I thought you may have thoughts when it comes to designing content of the class materials.
Interesting. I guess the questioner is objecting to the use of the term "had to return to Africa to get more laborers, get more slaves," as if it was a choice. It's not really. I mean. Yeah, that the person objects to that as if it was a choice, like why they couldn't go somewhere else. I hadn't really considered that before, but it seems to me that the crime here is the fact that sugar production was so intensive and deadly and profitable, and extraordinarily profitable, that the calculations that the planters in the Caribbean made, the calculation they made was that they could work their property to death, they could work their enslaved people to death, and they would still make money by purchasing new chattel property. And that to me is the crime. It sounded to me as if that is what the text was trying to convey.
It seems there's a larger issue of language too. I think that the question gets to not just this particular instance in regard to Caribbean slavery and the brutality of it, but the chosen language of textbooks. There are textbooks that I've heard of that describe slaves as laborers or workers. Migrant workers, and that's the operational term that's used throughout the textbook. Not that they're enslaved people, not that they're being compelled to do this, but they are workers, and slave revolts is sort of strikes. So I think there is a larger issue with, well, there are a few issues going on. Who writes the books and for what purpose and for what audiences? Who's behind the production of those textbooks? Who's screening the textbooks? Who's in the legislature, on the school board, and that's allowing for these things to be taught? And the nature of books too. Books, I think the very object of a book carries a certain sort of authority, especially with young people and even with people as old as I am. I think that there's a certain sort of authority that the printed word carries. And just imagine that with young people, if it's in a book, it must be real, right? Although perhaps in our digital age, maybe some of that privileging of the book is slipping away. But I think that not only the language, but the packaging is also insidious insofar as if it's in a book and my teacher is giving it to me, the presumption, I think, from many students is to assume that the book is truthful and that it's a positive good. So I think, as colleagues said earlier about the need to take courses in African American history and other kinds of histories as well, I think the need to be more conscious and vigilant about what gets put in books and carries the authority of book knowledge in the earlier ages and age brackets is extraordinarily important.
I agree. I mean, I think that we have to really realize the textbooks are not neutral. And there are so many resources out there now. The Zen Education, ZINN, named after Howard Zinn. Their Zen Education Project is doing amazing things. Hassan Jeffries has a whole podcast on teaching hard history. The Association of Black Women Historians just did a YouTube on history. I mean, there's so much proliferating now that teachers can avail themselves of. And I put in the chat a book that I co-edited for the African Diaspora Fellows Program. It came out of that. And that whole program is an effort to help equip teachers and build their capacity so they can teach differently. I mean, we have the books as a problem, but we also have what do teachers know, and them not always being equipped to teach students differently and reproducing misinformation, doing exercises where none of our teachers, hopefully we're doing that in our program, but you hear these atrocious stories about students reenacting slave escapes and, pretend you're a runaway slave and run through the woods at night, right? And really terrible things. So our teachers also need to be informed. And I think going back to Professor Williams's invocation of the former chancellor saying all UNC students should be required to take an African American Studies course, right? Making that a requirement for our students in college, but even before college, I think is essential to rupturing a lot of this ignorance that also then feeds racism and feeds divisiveness and feeds what we see in terms of the attitudes of police, right? It doesn't mean that education is the answer, because you can also have enlightened racists, right? But it's a start. And I have to invoke my grandmother here, because she always used to say, if white people knew more about us, they would respect us more. And I think that it is also empowering in a different kind of way for our white students to learn the full spectrum of US history and not just the part that uplifts white people.
Very good. And I think that's what makes course material selection a very important and very powerful duty for us instructors. I think I don't think there's such a thing as 100% objectivity. I've just come to believe that we can't be totally objective when we are writing our books. Everything is sort of brought in in some sort of bias, and which can occur almost, inadvertently. So I think when we choose these materials, it becomes critical. And also that's when personally I feel that I have power, seriously. I have power and I'm feeding these students with materials. So I need really to be careful and also to be as much learner-centered as possible, so I can allow them also to critically engage with the materials, because without that, you are condemning, you are feeding them into something you as a professor, you've probably been fed into. I also wanted to say that diversity is very important, because if I am to teach, well, I came from Senegal and I had my day in American studies before I got here. But if I were to teach an American studies class in Senegal, it may be content-wise and even the outcome. When I design my lesson plans, I use what we call the backward lesson planning. So based on my objectives, I can come up with a different content. So based on who is teaching that American studies class, you can find yourself with a different outcome. So I think there's a need for departments to diversify. We need Black professors, Indian American professors, so that we can sort of have different perspectives in students' intake, about a particular discipline, not just having all UNC students have to come to AAAD, for example, to get AAAD classes. I think that's just a thought I wanted to put out there. And then I will turn it over to Ron. And then when you're done, you turn it over to Lydia,
Okay.
please.
And I think it's really about decolonizing the curriculum. And so much of what we learn is colonized. It is it's sort of centered in the racist origins of education in this country and the world. And scholarship is propaganda. What you learn is the function of who wrote it. We need to change that, at this university and at universities around the country. And I think it gets back to the question in terms of what classes students take, what classes they're required to take. This gets back to the question of the role of, that you started out with in terms of the role of white Americans. Learning and knowledge is not all of it, but it is certainly part of it. Because much of the work of racial inequality in this moment and addressing it and bringing about substantive change is the work of white people to do. There's simply more of them. And so, that can start in as small as what you learn and go out into the world equipped to try to do, and the types of questions that white people are interested in answering. Is this going to be a fair and just world, or are we going to continue to be a racist, world and country? And I think that's really the question before us in this moment.
Wonderful.
All right, I think with that, we've come to the end of our planned amount of time. And I know there were a lot of people who posted questions that we weren't able to get to. And for that, I apologize. But it's nice that we ended up with this focus on courses and learning beyond the scope of this panel, because the issues that we're talking about are really complex and wide-ranging. So we encourage everyone to take a class in AAAD if you're able to. And I want to thank all of the panelists. I want to thank my co-moderator, Samba, and I'll turn it over to Eunice to just say a parting.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Lydia and the panelists. This has been very insightful. I'm very lucky to have all these wonderful colleagues who teach me a lot of things every day. I just wanted to mention that we'll be holding a second part to this panel next week, the same time. So if we didn't get to your questions, please don't give up. Just come to our panel next week. We'll have another webinar, just similar to this one. The only difference is that next Friday's forum will be led by our former distinguished students. So they've taken our courses. They took courses in other departments on campus. So you get to see, especially for students who joined us today, you get to interact with former UNC students who are doing outstanding work in the community, trying to transform some of the issues that we've been talking about today. So join us again next week, and please bring up your questions again, and we'll do our best to answer them. Okay, thank you so much. Bye, everyone. Have a great weekend. See you next weekend, next Friday. Bye. Okay,
Bye-bye.
Bye. Yeah.